I love hiking. The year before last, I took a trip up to remote parts of Alaska for a week-long trek. I was telling this story to a buddy of mine recently, and he insisted that I share it, saying it was pretty bizarre. Maybe he was right. There are plenty of people out there with their own strange experiences. My buddy's partner and I were in the northern part of Alaska. I won't specify the exact location since I'm always a bit wary of sharing too much online. Anyway, we were riding in a large vehicle, 5 of us in total. The back was fitted with a cover and had a small opening leading to the front that you could squeeze through. It was originally made for carrying gear like skis, but we hadn't packed any. It was a crisp winter night, and my friends and I were trying to play Magic: The Gathering in the back. Though, given the setting, it was more for fun than actual gameplay. The idea of a bunch of nerds playing card games in the middle of nowhere amused us. A few drinks were passed around, and we were having a blast when one of my friends suddenly called out, pointing at something outside. He was a nature enthusiast, always eager to identify any wildlife we encountered. My partner and I put our cards down and turned to see what he was looking at. Through the window, we could make out the dark shape of what looked like a moose or an elk in the distance. As we continued moving, the figure quickly disappeared, but it was thrilling to see such a large animal, our first significant sighting of the trip. This was only our second day out. We had planned to set up camp by Wednesday and head back to civilization the following week. After a few more hours, Dave, who was driving, pulled over so we could sleep. Most of the group was exhausted, but I still had some work to finish up. Even though I was technically on vacation, my job didn't really allow me to disconnect completely. Whether out of obligation or personal pride, I kept at it. Dave muttered something, but I ignored him, unable to hear over my music. About 20 minutes later, though, I caught his voice again, barely audible over my headphones. When I looked over, he was completely asleep. In fact, everyone was. I glanced outside, scanning the sparse trees bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing. I've traveled enough to know that stray noises happen all the time. Whether it's whispers in an airport or birds calling in a small town, everything has an explanation. I went back to work, this time without music. 5 minutes later, my partner stirred and asked me to keep it down. I told her I hadn't made a sound. Since I was already up, I decided to take over driving duties. I did a quick head count to make sure everyone was accounted for before starting the engine. As I pulled away, I checked the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it again. That same deer-like creature, though now I could only make out its antlers, with its head lowered and body hidden behind a tree. The image stuck with me because it was eerily illuminated by the moonlight. Despite the oddness of it, I brushed it off and kept driving. Over the next day, as we neared our camping site, we spotted the horned creature a few more times. Maybe it was different animals each time, but something about it seemed off. Still, I'm a skeptic by nature, so I dismissed any uneasy feelings. That night, we set up camp, which involved assembling a rooftop tent, an absolute nightmare to put together. It attached to the top of the truck, and since it was Dave's vehicle, he was the one who had built it. He was more into the survivalist aspect than the rest of us. My friend took the tent while my partner and I were given the truck bed, partly out of respect and partly because sleeping inside seemed more comfortable. Feeling restless, I decided to take a walk. My partner, exhausted, chose to stay and sleep. I grabbed my machete, not for defense, but mainly for clearing the occasional low-hanging branch. Not long into my walk, I heard my partner calling my name. I turned towards the truck's lights in the distance, but as I listened closer, I realized the voice was coming from the opposite direction. I froze. Something wasn't right. The voice sounded exactly the same each time it called, like a recording on repeat. A chill ran down my spine, and I sprinted back toward the truck. Panicked, I jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. Technically, you're not supposed to drive with a tent set up on the roof, but it was bolted down securely, and I wasn't about to stick around. As I sped off, I saw that deer-like creature again. This time, it was charging at the truck, somehow keeping up with my speed. Then it let out the most horrifying sound I've ever heard. A wail. Something so unnerving that I broke down in tears. My friends, startled by my sudden panic, pounded on the roof, demanding I stop. I didn't. Instead, I barreled through a shallow stream, the rocky terrain no doubt denting the truck and rattling the guys up top. Then, out of nowhere, a gunshot rang out. Then another, and a third. I kept driving for another 5 minutes before stopping in a clearing. The creature was gone. My friends hurriedly climbed down, packed up the tent, and barked at me to drive. I turned to look at my partner, her face pressed against the window, pale with fear. When she finally looked at me, I saw tears streaming down her face. She wasn't someone who enjoyed horror movies, and if one scared her, she usually cried. But this was something else entirely. We drove in complete silence for the next 4 hours, waiting for the sun to rise. In the morning, we finally talked about what had happened. I recounted my part of the story, and none of us had any clear answers. The best explanation came from our friend Sean, who suggested it might have been a moose with rabies. Maybe, but that didn't explain how it had kept up with the truck, or why its face, as my friends described, looked distorted. None of us were eager to stick around, so we decided to cut our trip short, taking a detour through some nearby villages instead of the isolated, scenic route. The rest of the trip was great, and we met some kind locals, but we never brought up what happened, not to anyone else, and not even to each other. As for me, I don't buy the rabies theory, not even close, because nothing explains how I heard my partner's voice, exactly as it was, looping over and over again, from the woods when she had never left the truck. If you ever find yourself deep in the wilderness, make sure you have a flashlight and something to defend yourself with. You never know what's lurking just beyond the trees. But one thing's for sure, if it wants to catch you, running won't save you, and throwing a rock at it will only make it angrier. Hey Swamp Dweller, just wanted to say your podcast is amazing, and I hope it stays up for many years. While listening to one of your latest episodes about crime, I suddenly remembered some eerie experiences my brother and I had while hiking together. For context, I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and on weekends I used to escape city life by hiking in the nearby hills, exploring abandoned drainage tunnels, and my personal favorite, wandering along the Rio Grande to see how the swampy desert landscape had changed over time. But after my last trip, I don't think I'll ever go back. It was a mild Sunday afternoon when we set out to hike along the rugged trails. I had just gotten my driver's license and was eager to take the car out on my own. This time, though, I wasn't alone. My 2 younger brothers were with me, which in hindsight was a relief because things had definitely changed. As we walked, I noticed the amount of trash had more than doubled. Crushed cans, plastic grocery bags, and every kind of litter you could imagine were scattered across the dried-up riverbed. In the past, we had tried picking up some of it, but now the sheer amount was overwhelming. It would take a full crew to clean it up. Further down the trail, a ranger appeared, stepping off the path and heading toward a homeless man. I wasn't sure what he was doing. There was a tent set up, and he was shuffling through a pile of garbage. She spoke with him briefly before turning back the way she came, passing by us as the man wandered over a large mound of dirt. Another homeless person had set up camp nearby, watching us closely. He then slipped into his tent, and we decided it was time to move on. We retraced our steps and veered off onto another path leading to the riverside. There, we spotted an aluminum can. Inside was a lizard, trapped and struggling. It was unsettling to see how the pollution was directly harming the wildlife. I had encountered the same thing before, the same kind of can, the same type of lizard, strangely enough. The opening was too small for it to escape, so we carefully cut the can open to free it. As we continued walking along the riverbank, we stumbled upon another makeshift campsite, surrounded by mounds of toilet paper and, unfortunately, human waste. Disgusted, we turned back, choosing to follow the river in another direction. But soon, we encountered yet another homeless man, this one bathing and drinking from the river. That was enough for us. We left the area and made our way back to the main trail. As we passed the mound of dirt where we had seen the first homeless man, we realized he had circled around and was now ahead of us. My younger brother, usually cautious, climbed up the mound and looked down. "Hey, there's another tent here," he called out. "Get down," my other brother warned, but he ignored him, moving closer to investigate. I wasn't even sure if anyone was inside. "Get back here now," I hissed, my voice echoing under the massive bridge. My brother didn't listen. Instead, he picked up a rock and tossed it toward the tent. That was it. I climbed up, grabbed him by the arm, and yanked him back down. He was furious with me, but I didn't care. Messing with someone's shelter was just stupid. I decided it was time to head to higher ground, or better yet, home. As we climbed up the trail, we found more tents scattered around. Old, tattered magazines were piled next to rusty needles. I just hoped that if we ran into someone, they would let us pass without trouble. But it had been years since I last explored this area, and it was nothing like before. As we reached a cluster of mesquite trees, we spotted another homeless man. But this wasn't just some frail guy living in a tent. This man was huge, at least 6 feet 5 inches, and built like a linebacker. He glanced in our direction before vanishing into the trees. I didn't see which way he went, but I knew it was time to leave, especially when we noticed another man slowly trailing behind us. We darted into the brush, where we found more makeshift shelters draped over tree branches. Strangely, it seemed like no one was there. This place had turned into a maze of overgrown, trash-littered underbrush, and as we moved through it, we heard something. I turned to my brothers. "Did you hear that?" They both nodded, probably trying to convince themselves it was just an animal so they wouldn't panic. But we kept moving, crawling through thorny bushes. The noise behind us grew louder. Whatever it wasn't small, it was big. Bigger than a coyote. The sound of snapping branches and crunching leaves told me that something, or someone, was charging through the brush. "Run," I whispered. We scrambled, pushing through the tangled undergrowth. Thorns ripped at our clothes and skin as we blindly fled, knives drawn just in case we needed to defend ourselves. The footsteps behind us grew faster, heavier, closing in. If whoever was chasing us caught up, we were ready for a last stand. "There!" one of my brothers pointed. The bushes thinned, revealing a way out. Without hesitation, we lunged forward, practically throwing ourselves out of the thicket. We climbed up a steep rock face, our hands scraping against the stone as we clawed our way to safety. The moment we made it to open ground, the pursuit stopped. Whatever was following us turned back, crashing through the brush in the opposite direction. Up ahead, we spotted a ranger's truck parked along the trail. That was our signal that we were finally safe. But we didn't say anything to her. Who would believe us? Anyway, instead, we walked back to the parking lot, piled into our old sedan, and left. I haven't been back since. And honestly, I don't plan on going back anytime soon. A year ago, I relocated from a small town to an isolated valley deep in the wilderness, surrounded by a national park with only a handful of neighbors. It was exactly the peaceful, remote life I had wanted at the time. I had been working as a paramedic for about 5 or 6 years, and since I loved the outdoors and wanted to give back to the community, I joined a local search and rescue team. Despite being a small, underfunded group, we were constantly busy. In the 9 years I volunteered, we handled at least one rescue, sometimes several, every weekend from spring to fall. The majority of our calls came from about 100 miles of poorly maintained fire trails, which were popular with dirt bike and ATV riders. Inevitably, people got lost, crashed, or got hurt, and we'd have to go out, find them, provide first aid, and either get them airlifted or transport them in a stretcher mounted on a rickety trailer pulled by an ATV. About 2 weeks after I joined, with no training beyond my experience as a Boy Scout and a paramedic, I got my first call. A group of dirt bikers from out of town had lost one of their riders. For some reason, they had placed their least experienced rider at the back of the group of about a dozen people, and when they took off into the woods, he fell behind. When they returned to the parking area about 4 hours later, he was missing. They spent another 4 or 5 hours searching before giving up and calling emergency services. The response time from the initial call to us assembling a team at the trailhead was impressive, no more than 20 or 30 minutes. But by then, we were already nearly 9 hours behind. After a quick briefing, we split into groups, handed out maps, and set off into the woods. I was paired with the most experienced searcher and put on an ATV. The plan was simple. Each 2 or 3 person team would take one of the longer trails that looped around the area. Once we cleared those, we would move inward, searching the shorter, maze-like paths in the center. This was what they called a hasty search. No grid search or slow combing through every inch of ground. We were just trying to cover as much ground as fast as possible, looking for signs of the missing rider. I hadn't known what to expect, but I had pictured a few dirt roads winding through the trees. Instead, the trails were a nightmare, rugged, technical paths where you had to know exactly what you were doing or risk getting hopelessly lost. GPS was unreliable due to the thick tree cover and steep terrain. Radios and cell phones barely worked, and the maps didn't account for all the random paths riders had carved out over time. Only the fire roads were clearly marked, and they made up maybe 10% of the total trails. Why this guy hadn't been paired with someone or put at the front of the group is still a mystery to me. For hours into the search, I was covered in mud, scratched up from branches, completely exhausted, and just done. We stopped for a water break when we heard broken radio chatter. Something about the bike being found, but no sign of the rider. It was only a few miles from us, so we headed that way. When we arrived, the missing man's dirt bike was sitting just off the trail, still intact. The quads from the other teams were parked nearby, but the searchers were a few hundred feet into the trees. We walked over and found them standing around the missing rider. He was dead. His lips were blue, his skin had a grayish hue, and his arms were spread out like a cross. At first, it looked like his eyes were wide open and pure white, but when I checked closer, I realized they were covered in fly eggs. He had been dead for some time. It didn't make sense. His bike had plenty of fuel, he still had water and snacks, and he was a fit guy in his late 20s. Why did he die? It looked like he had laid his bike down, run into the woods, and collapsed. We wrapped him in blankets, loaded him onto the stretcher, and took him back to the trailhead where the coroner was waiting. A week later, I ran into the coroner and asked what had caused his death. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrhythmia triggered by extreme anxiety. In other words, he died of pure fear. Up until that moment, I had always thought that was just something you saw in movies. I still wonder what went through his mind in those last moments. Was he just terrified of being lost in the woods? If so, why didn't he just follow the trail back? Or did he see something out there? I've heard plenty of strange stories about the forest, and I've even seen a few odd things myself. So it wouldn't surprise me if he encountered something none of us could explain. I wanted to share this story because it's one of those mysteries that's always stuck with me, one I've never been able to fully understand. I had been planning this trip for years, ever since I was a young teenager. Hiking had become one of my biggest passions, and after spending countless weekends exploring trails with friends, I eventually learned about the Coast to Coast Trail. I knew right away that it was something I had to complete, especially if I ever wanted to conquer the full Triple Trek challenge. So when the day finally arrived, I was beyond excited to set foot on the trail. The beauty of the landscape stretched endlessly before me, filling me with a deep sense of adventure. My backpack was loaded with all the essentials, and I knew I was in for an incredible few nights surrounded by nature. However, as my journey progressed, I started noticing small details that felt off. At first, I brushed them aside, thinking I was overanalyzing things. But then, I came across something that made my entire body freeze. I had been hiking for hours when I finally entered a clearing deep in the woods. At first glance, it seemed like the perfect place to set up camp. A quiet, peaceful spot away from the main trail. But as I stepped forward, I noticed the ground was covered in strange symbols. I had seen markings earlier along the way, but these were larger, more defined, and much more unsettling. Dried stains, maybe old blood, filled the grooves of the symbols. Around them, eerie structures stood tall, totems crafted from sticks and bones. The air itself felt thick and suffocating, charged with something unnatural. It reminded me of some kind of ritual site, but nothing like I had ever seen before. It felt straight out of a nightmare. As I cautiously explored, I suddenly became aware of movement ahead. A group of people, dressed in long, hooded robes, stood together in a loose circle. Their faces were completely covered, and they were chanting low, rhythmic, and completely foreign to me. The sound was guttural, almost inhuman, sending an instant chill down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to turn and leave. I know it sounds like something straight out of a horror movie, but the moment I saw them, saw the way they moved in perfect sync, heard the way their voices rose and fell in an eerie harmony, I knew I had to get out. But just as I turned to leave, one of them must have noticed me. The chanting stopped. One of the figures stepped forward, locking eyes with me. The look they gave me, there are no words for it. It wasn't just intense. It was like their stare physically gripped me, holding me in place. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. My breathing hitched as the figure began speaking directly to me. The words made no sense. They were rough, ancient, almost vibrating in my skull. The more they spoke, the more terrified I became. Then the others joined in, their voices layered together in an overwhelming wave of sound. And suddenly, I could feel my body weakening. My legs felt impossibly heavy, my limbs numb. It was as if their words were draining me, stripping me of the ability to fight back. My vision blurred as they moved closer. Their eyes, every single one of them, glowed with a strange, unnatural light. I knew in that moment that I was in serious danger. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move, couldn't even scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. A brilliant flash of white light erupted before me. In the blink of an eye, the figures were gone. The clearing was empty. The only sound left was my own ragged breathing. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car miles away, but I didn't care. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could have convinced me to stay on that trail a second longer. I know what I experienced was real. I know I came face to face with something beyond human understanding. Some believe it was some kind of extraterrestrial encounter. Others think it might have been something paranormal or even an interdimensional event. I don't know what to call it, but I do know this. I'll never forget the fear I felt on that trail. If anyone reading this has any idea what I experienced, please let me know. I've always been a fan of hiking, just like a lot of people, and I especially enjoyed visiting my nearby national park. There was something about the thick woods, the sound of birds, and the crisp, fresh air that made me feel alive. I didn't live in a massive city, but I still dealt with the everyday stresses that come with life. Little did I know, though, that one particular outing would change everything for me. It would alter how I saw the world forever. It was a stunning fall morning when I decided to go on a hike. The trees had turned shades of golden yellow and deep red, and the sun shone brightly overhead. I packed my bag, tightened my boots, and set off down the trail. I was alone, but that didn't bother me. The stillness of the forest always gave me a sense of peace. It was almost like therapy. After a couple of hours of walking, I noticed something felt off. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds were singing, no leaves rustling, nothing. Classic horror movie moment, right? At first, I brushed it off, convincing myself I was just imagining things. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from a cluster of bushes. Because of how quiet everything had become, the sound was impossible to miss. My heart had already started pounding, but now it was slamming against my ribs. I slowly turned toward the bushes, trying to see what was hiding in them. That's when I saw it. The thing standing there was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It had the body of a wolf, but its eyes looked disturbingly human. Its fur was pitch black, absorbing the light around it. It locked eyes with me, and I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. My feet stumbled against the uneven path, and before I knew it, I hit the ground hard. I turned my head to look back, and there it was, still watching me. It hadn't moved a muscle. That's when it clicked. I'd heard about creatures like this before, in stories and podcasts. This thing was something I never thought I'd see in real life. A skinwalker. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, bolting as fast as I could. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. But the creature wasn't just standing still anymore. It was coming after me. Faster than anything I thought was possible. Within moments, I could hear it right behind me, feel its presence closing in. I was trapped. I had no idea where I was. My fear had kept me from paying attention to trail markers, and now I was lost in the middle of the woods with this thing right on my heels. Then, a memory surfaced. An old story I'd heard before. Something about these creatures being unable to cross running water. I had no idea if it was a physical limitation or something supernatural, but at that moment, I was willing to try anything. I frantically scanned my surroundings and, to my relief, spotted a small stream nearby. I forced myself to sprint towards it with everything I had left, leaping over the water and landing on the other side. When I turned to look back, the creature was gone. Couldn't believe it. I was still alive. But then I noticed something else. The reason it had disappeared wasn't the stream. A group of hikers had appeared on the trail just beyond me. Had it been planning to go after them instead? I never heard of any incidents in the area afterward, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I hurried back over the stream and made my way toward my car, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. My hands were still shaking by the time I locked my doors and started the engine. I never went hiking alone again. I learned my lesson that day. The woods may be breathtaking, but they can also be unpredictable and full of danger. You never truly know what's waiting in the shadows. So if you ever find yourself out there, be cautious. Stay alert, because while bears and mountain lions are terrifying, there are far worse things that might be lurking just out of sight. I've always loved trekking through the Rocky Mountains. How could you not? The fresh air, towering evergreens, and stunning scenery never fail to leave me amazed. Today was no exception. As I ascended the trail, a deep sense of calm and serenity settled over me. But that peaceful moment was shattered when I spotted something I never expected to see in this area anymore. A cougar. It was crouched low, its piercing gaze locked onto me. My heart pounded with fear. I had read about what to do in such a situation, but putting that knowledge into action was far more difficult than I had imagined. I knew I had to make myself look larger and make loud noises to scare it off, or at least that was the plan. Desperately, I lifted my arms high, trying to appear as big as possible, while clapping and shouting. The cougar didn't flinch. It kept staring, its eyes cold and unyielding. Then, in an instant, like a predator springing into action, it lunged, fangs bared. I stumbled backward, barely dodging its attack. My pulse raced as I realized just how serious this was. This wasn't a warning. The cougar was trying to kill me. I attempted to step back slowly, but the animal was far too fast and relentless, closing the distance with ease. I could feel its hot breath on my face as it snarled, mere inches away. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might explode. I tried retreating again, but my foot caught on a rock, and I tumbled to the ground. This was my worst nightmare. Lying on my back, I suddenly felt a searing pain. It had sunk its teeth into my arm. I let out a scream, hoping someone would hear me, but the only sound was the cougar's furious growling. At that moment, I knew I wouldn't make it unless I acted fast. Frantically, I scanned my surroundings and spotted a rock nearby. With all my strength, I grabbed it and smashed it against the cougar. It let out a pained yelp and released me, just for a split second, but enough for me to scramble to my feet and sprint away as fast as possible. But the cougar wasn't done with me yet. It pursued me, its powerful limbs propelling it forward at a terrifying speed. I could once again feel its hot breath against my back. My lungs burned as I pushed myself to run faster, my legs barely keeping up. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a ranger station in the distance. Summoning every ounce of energy left, I dashed toward it, praying someone was inside. As I burst through the door, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air and struggling to get the words out. The ranger immediately called for an ambulance, and I was rushed to the hospital. I ended up with deep gashes on my arms and legs and was covered in bruises, but in the end, I was alive and incredibly fortunate to be. That day in the Rockies was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I will never forget the sheer terror I felt as the cougar's jaws clamped onto me. I'm grateful to have survived, especially since the attack could have been much worse. Apparently, there had been issues with a young cougar recently relocated to this area. I'm almost certain that was the one that attacked me. It likely wasn't as skilled at hunting as expected and saw me as easy prey. Despite everything, I don't hold any grudges against wildlife. I'm not afraid of cougars or bears, and I don't hate them for what happened. But if I can offer any advice, it's this. Be as cautious as possible, stay aware of your surroundings, and always carry some form of protection. A deterrent spray could end up being your best defense in situations like these. I had been looking forward to this trip for a long time, and now that I was finally deep in the remote backcountry, I felt more alive than I had in ages. The crisp air and the breathtaking landscape around me filled me with excitement. I had my backpack packed with all the essentials: my tent, food, and the gear I needed for a few nights out in the wild. Hiking and camping had always been a passion of mine, and I felt completely at home in nature. But as evening crept in and the sky turned dim, I sensed something change. The air grew colder, and the once peaceful forest seemed to take on an unsettling stillness. A strange feeling crept up my spine, a sensation of being watched. The hairs on my arms bristled. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the unease only deepened as I continued walking, and by the time the last rays of sunlight vanished beyond the treetops, I knew I had to set up camp. I found a small clearing and quickly pitched my tent. After gathering some wood, I built a modest fire to keep warm. I settled into my sleeping bag, hoping for a restful night. But as I lay there, a sound reached my ears, something moving just beyond my tent. At first, I reassured myself that it had to be a wild animal. But as I listened closer, doubt crept in. The footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy. They didn't belong to any animal I knew. They sounded like a person's, yet I was miles away from any other hikers or campsites. I tried to dismiss my growing fear, but the footsteps lingered. The slow, steady pacing continued throughout the night, and I barely managed to sleep. By morning, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. I hurried to pack up my gear and move on, hoping to shake off the eerie events of the night. But as I stepped onto the trail, the footsteps returned. Only now, they were louder, faster, and seemed to echo from every direction. I quickened my pace, trying to escape whatever was following me. No matter how fast I walked, the steps kept matching mine. They were closing in. Worse, I could hear breathing, ragged, heavy breathing. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. It was as though something unseen was hunting me, surrounding me on all sides. Panic surged through me, and I ran, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps pounded behind me, growing more frenzied with every step. I knew I couldn't outrun whatever was there, but I had no other choice. Then suddenly I tripped. I hit the ground hard. The air knocked from my lungs. As I lay there, a chill crawled down my spine. I felt something icy, damp breath brushing against the back of my neck. My body froze, my mind racing. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for whatever came next. But then silence. The footsteps had stopped. The presence was gone. I cautiously opened my eyes, and the forest was exactly as it had been before. Quiet, undisturbed. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Shaking, I forced myself to stand and kept moving, never daring to look back. I never told anyone what happened that night, but even now, I can still hear those footsteps echoing in my memory, a reminder of the terror that lurks deep in the wilderness. This took place around May or June of this year. My cousin and I were both 12 years old and living in Mississippi. Whenever she visited, we had a habit of riding around the neighborhood in my golf cart. It was fun at first, but after doing the same loops every time, it started to get dull. Wanting to change things up, we stopped at a dried-up creek near my street. I parked the golf cart at the end of a neighbor's driveway, the same neighbor whose property had always given us a weird feeling. One time, we even thought we heard distant screams coming from their backyard. Curious, we hopped out of the golf cart and peered into the ditch, hoping to spot something interesting. About 6 feet in, I noticed some old wooden planks scattered along the bank. It was just enough to pique our curiosity, so we jumped in. As we wandered deeper, we heard something rustling nearby, but we brushed it off, figuring it was just a squirrel or maybe a possum. Roughly 30 feet in, we came across an open clearing. It seemed like a great spot to explore, so we decided to hike to the other side. However, as we continued, we reached a marshy section filled with mosquitoes. That was enough for us. We turned around and started heading home before it got too dark. My cousin and I were both amazed at how much bigger the ditch was than we had originally thought. Later that night, I told her older sister all about it. The next day, we returned to what we now called the hollow. This time, we wore better shoes to avoid slipping. As soon as we stepped in, we heard that same rustling from the day before, but this time, it was much closer and louder. A little uneasy, we cautiously made our way through the clearing, keeping an eye out for anyone who might be nearby. After all, the ditch wasn't far from our creepy neighbor's house. When we reached the swampy area again, we decided to climb out and investigate where the sound had been coming from. In hindsight, it was a reckless decision, but everyone has a little curiosity, right? With every step we took, spiders scattered out from beneath the leaves, almost like something straight out of a horror movie. As we pushed forward, we stumbled upon a hidden stash, an old bag of what looked like weed, shattered glass bottles, and a pair of torn-up sneakers. Something about those shoes sent chills down my spine, and I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to leave. My cousin, on the other hand, wanted to keep looking around. As we continued, we came across a fallen tree covered in fresh trash. I had just started making my way back toward the ditch when my cousin suddenly shouted, "I found something!" Alarmed, I rushed over to where she was pointing, at a scattered pile of bones. Our first thought was that they might belong to a child, but since there was no skull, they could have just been from an animal. In moments like that, your mind always jumps to the worst-case scenario. Just as we stepped closer to get a better look, the sound of heavy footsteps crashed through the undergrowth. Startled, we spun around, and what we saw was absolutely terrifying. A man was crouched in the shadows. His long, filthy hair hung in tangled clumps, and his fingernails were caked in something dark, something that looked like dried blood. He was hunched over like a wild animal, and for a moment we thought he was about to lunge. But instead, he bolted away from us, disappearing into the trees. Just when we thought we were safe, he suddenly stopped behind a tree and turned to stare. That was enough for us. We tore through the woods and sprinted back to the golf cart, our hearts pounding. To this day, I refuse to look down that road whenever I pass by. My cousin and I never talked about what happened, and we never told anyone else about the hollow. I'm a 17-year-old guy, and my name is Aaron. I like to think of myself as a pretty rational person. I've always been very aware of my surroundings, maybe even a little overly cautious. Honestly, if I weren't this way, I might not be here to tell this story. When I was about 16, my friend, let's call him Jake, and I were biking along a remote, narrow path in one of the lesser-known parts of Montana. I won't say the exact place, but it was the kind of back road you'd expect in the middle of nowhere. Mostly dirt, winding through thick trees that got denser the farther you went. We had biked these trails before, and while they always had a slightly eerie feel, it just made the rides more thrilling. But that day, we had no idea we were about to experience something straight out of a nightmare. I guess no one ever does. We had been riding for nearly 2 hours, stopping only for quick water breaks or to grab a bite of the snacks we'd packed. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened on these little stops. But on this particular ride, We didn't stop as often because we kept hearing strange noises around us. Still, after nearly 3 hours of biking, we needed a break. We spotted a fallen tree trunk and decided to rest there for a bit. About 5 minutes into our break, we heard it, what sounded like a woman screaming. It seemed to be coming from about 400 yards away, deep in the woods to our left. Being two teenage boys, we wanted to act tough, so we decided to check it out. We wandered the area for around 20 minutes but found absolutely nothing. When we returned, though, our bikes were completely wrecked. The chains were snapped, the tires were slashed, and the gear shifters had been torn clean off the handlebars. My stomach dropped. I felt sick. At first, I thought maybe some random person had passed by and done it as a cruel prank. But before we could think much more about it, we heard something. A loud, sharp crack, like a thick tree branch being smashed against a trunk. The sound was sudden and close. Slowly, I turned around. What I saw is something I can barely describe. It was tall, easily over 6 feet, covered in shaggy hair, with a long snout that stretched down to its chest. Hanging from its chin were strange, wiry tendrils, and above them, 2 beady black eyes. At the top of its head, large, curled horns jutted outward. My friend and I didn't hesitate. We bolted, weaving through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us and whatever that thing was. I don't know if it actually chased us, but the second we started running, it let out 2 of the strangest, most horrifying noises I've ever heard. It was like a mix between a pig's squeal and an eagle's screech, an unnatural, piercing sound that made my skin crawl. Eventually, we burst onto a nearby road and frantically called my dad to pick us up. We never told him the full story, just that our bikes had been stolen when we stepped away for a moment. To this day, I have no idea what I saw that afternoon. I don't go biking or hiking in isolated areas anymore. I stick to trails where there are plenty of people around. And to that thing in the woods, let's never cross paths again. My name is Eric and I live in Sweden, where I also have a small cabin. I've wanted to share my experience for a long time. I swear I saw something one day that I can only describe as a troll. One autumn afternoon, my family and I, 4 of us in total, decided to take a long, peaceful hike up a mountain. We love nature, so we were soaking in the beautiful scenery. Since I enjoy long walks and exploring the outdoors, I had been looking forward to this trip. As we were walking, we noticed a hare dashing away from something. The creature it was fleeing from was massive, at least 3 or 4 feet tall. We didn't get a clear look at it, so we kept moving, continuing to enjoy our hike. After some time, we finally reached the summit. The view was breathtaking. As I took in the landscape, I spotted something large in the distance. It took me a moment to recognize it, but I was sure it was the same thing I had seen earlier. This time, it was holding something. I can't say for certain, but it looked about the same size and shape as the hare we had seen before. It was muttering something, maybe even chanting, before suddenly crushing the animal's head. I gasped, shocked and horrified. The creature had long, filthy greenish hair and an enormous nose. It wore tattered animal pelts, probably to keep warm. As soon as I gasped, it turned toward us. It must have heard me, and then it screamed. That scream, it was horrifying, like a mix between a moose's bellow and the wail of a dying goat. Its eyes glowed yellow, and its mouth was filled with jagged, rotting teeth. But the worst part was the other side of its face, where there were twisted, distorted shapes, almost like the faces of crying children. Just looking at it made my stomach turn. We didn't hesitate. We bolted down the mountain, shoving past each other in a desperate panic to escape. I've been on edge ever since that night, and sometimes, late at night, deep in the woods, I swear I can still hear that terrible screaming and chanting. Just remember, whether you're hiking up a mountain or taking a quiet walk alone, you're never truly alone. Before I begin telling this story, I want to make it absolutely clear to everyone listening. This really happened. Every part of it is true. A friend of mine and I had decided to go hunting in a new area. This particular spot was roughly 4 miles away from my house. My dad dropped us off about a mile in to cut down on the walking distance, but even then, we still had quite a trek ahead of us. The good part was that going this deep into the woods meant we wouldn't scare off the deer. It was around 5:20 in the morning when we started heading in. As we walked, I glanced up toward the tree line and noticed a tall figure standing there. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just a trick of the light. Maybe some oddly shaped trees or branches forming a silhouette. You know how your mind sometimes plays tricks on you, making random shapes look familiar? I didn't mention it to my friend and just kept walking, dismissing it as nothing. Not even 30 yards ahead, a noise up the steep embankment grabbed my attention. When I turned to look, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It had to be around 6'4" or 5" taller than me, and I'm 6'2". My instincts kicked in, and I quickly moved behind a tree, thinking maybe it was just another hunter. But then the real fear set in. We were a good 5 miles away from the nearest road, and there were no property lines anywhere close by. There shouldn't have been anyone else out there. I had already loaded a .308 full metal jacket round into my Remington. I told my friend I didn't care who or what it was. If it came any closer, I was ready to take it down. We waited for about 3 minutes, barely breathing, before the thing started making its way down the side of the mountain toward us. It wasn't scared at all. It moved with an eerie confidence, like it knew exactly where we were. As it got closer, I was able to see it more clearly. It was tall, thin, and the thing that truly sent a chill through me was the hat on its head. But what really made my blood run cold was when I noticed the fur. It had the snout and thick coat of a coyote, but it wasn't a coyote. Whoever this was had draped themselves in the hide of one. My hands went numb, and my finger hovered over the trigger. I was frozen in place, both terrified and completely bewildered by what I was seeing. I couldn't take it anymore. I raised my rifle and fired. The moment the bullet struck, the most unearthly sound erupted from the thing. It's hard to describe. It was somewhere between a panther's scream and the deep, haunting call of an elk. We didn't stick around to see what happened next. Without hesitation, we bolted toward the nearest road, not stopping until we were out of those woods. To this day, I have never returned to that part of the land. I refuse to, but my friend and I still talk about that morning, replaying it over and over, trying to make sense of what we saw. I don't know what it was, and I don't know what it wanted. All I do know is that whatever it was, there was no way it was human. Harlan, it was sometime in late July *** when I decided to take a hike that would last until around 10:30 at night. I was feeling anxious about my upcoming tests, and hiking always helped me clear my mind. There was a parking area near the trail I planned to take, and when I arrived, I noticed there were only about 3 other cars parked there. One of them looked especially run down, covered in dents and scratches. Inside that beat-up car sat a man, probably in his mid-40s, just staring at me as I stepped onto the trail. His gaze made me uneasy, but I tried to ignore it and continued on my way. About half an hour into my hike, I spotted him again. He had taken a separate path but had stopped to watch me once more. As the sky darkened, it must have been close to 9 p.m. I suddenly heard the sound of leaves crunching behind me. I immediately turned toward the noise, switching on my flashlight, but to my surprise, no one was there. The unsettling feeling in my gut only grew stronger, and since it was getting late, I figured it was best to head back. The parking lot was about 30 minutes away, so I picked up my pace. Just as I was nearing the entrance to the lot, I heard footsteps. No, running, right behind me. My heart jumped, and without a second thought, I took off sprinting. Glancing over my shoulder, I caught sight of that grimy, disheveled man charging toward me. In one hand, he clutched a rag, and in the other, a small spray bottle. Panic surged through me as I bolted toward my car, fumbling for my keys. My only thought was to get inside before he could reach me. I barely made it. The second I yanked the door open and jumped inside, he grabbed for the handle, but I managed to lock the doors just in time. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The look on his face was pure madness as he pounded against the window. I hit the gas, peeling out of there as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I watched as he took off toward the woods, disappearing into the darkness. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone and called 911. I have no idea what happened to him after that. I can only hope the police found him before he could get to anyone else. Who knows where he is now, or worse, who else he's gone after.